Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Have you got a ton of produce that's ripening right now? Well, today's topic is preserving the harvest, and I've got a great overview for you of all of the methods that you can use to preserve the wonderful produce that you've grown this year. The first thing I wanted to do before I get started is to mention two great resources that you will definitely want to take advantage of. The first is a website. It's completely free, and it's called the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's affiliated with the University of Georgia, and it has all kinds of detailed information, step-by-step instructions for all of the different types of preserving methods that I'm going to mention today. Now, the second thing is you might want to consider picking up a copy of the Ball Blue Book. This does not cost very much. It's filled with all kinds of recipes and, again, step-by-step instructions. And I definitely recommend this. They usually update it every few years, and so every few years I pick up a new copy. But it is a great resource. It's inexpensive and well worth it. There are a few vegetables that lend themselves to the easiest kind of storing there is. I'm out in our shop right now, and you'll notice that on this tarp I have a whole pile of onions. And what I'm doing is I'm waiting for them to be completely dry. And so that means that these stems should be just papery dry, the leaves completely dry. So we're waiting on that, and then we'll snip off the stalks and store them in our basement in a dark, cool area. So the first thing you do after you harvest onions, garlic, and shallots is you put them somewhere where they're protected from the weather and in a light area but not subjected to direct sunlight, and you just let them dry out completely. This usually takes a few weeks, and then you would move them down into your basement or into a dark area, because I realize not everybody has a basement, but somewhere dark and cool. Another easy thing to store is winter squash, like what you're looking at, and pumpkins. The first thing you need to do before you harvest them is do the thumbnail test. That's where you're pressing with your thumbnail into the skin and seeing if it will cut through the skin. If it does, that means that it's not mature yet. You just leave it alone, let it keep growing until it does pass the thumbnail test. But when it does, make sure that you leave a couple of inches of stem on the winter squash or pumpkins before you pick them. And then you're going to cure them for 2 weeks. This is really important. You want to put them somewhere that is sunny and bright, that's warm, and protected from the weather, so you don't want them to get frosted. But if you do this for 2 weeks, they will last so long in storage you won't believe it. Now what I use is my little unheated greenhouse because it's real bright and warm. I realize not everybody has a greenhouse. You could put it in a sunny porch. You could put them maybe in a carport that gets a lot of light, but somewhere that is protected from frost and gets plenty of light and warmth. Then you're going to move them into a dark area such as a basement or in the back of a dark closet, and that's where you can store them during the winter months until you need them. Other types of vegetables that are easy to store through the winter months are root crops. So things like carrots and parsnips, that's what you're looking at here, rutabagas, beets, and potatoes. So what we do is we harvest all of them, and with the exception of the potatoes, which we do not get wet, we rinse some of the soil off of the carrots, parsnips, rutabagas, and beets. And we use Rubbermaid bins that have the lids on them. We fill them with lightly moistened straw and layer the root crops into each bin and label them. We don't snap the lid on tight on the top, but we do rest it on there just to keep some of the moisture in the bin. With potatoes, we don't wash them off. This is very important, but we do put them into a shady area where they don't get any sun on them for a couple of days before moving them into storage, and that's so that the soil that was on them when we dug them up has dried and fallen off. And we put them in layers within the moistened straw into the bins. Now we keep our bins in our garage. It is insulated but not heated, and so it stays cool in there, but it doesn't get super cold. And you will be amazed at how long the root crops will store in this manner. Some veggies are really easy to freeze. So I like to cut the stalks of celery, chop them up, and put them into freezer bags. I do the same with some onions. And also I chop up spinach and Swiss chard leaves. Now these will not be in the best of shape after a while in the freezer, but they are great to add to soups and stews. So that is a great way to use up some of the last things you have that might get frosted otherwise. Now I'm not crazy about showing somebody the inside of my basement freezer, so I hope you appreciate the fact that I'm sharing this with you. But the whole point is that freezing is such an easy way to preserve your produce. If you look, there's a whole bunch of sweet corn, there's shredded zucchini, here's a whole bunch of blueberries. I make puree of different types of fruits and freeze it so that I can make jam in the middle of the winter. You'll notice there's a whole bunch of Musica pole beans, my favorite beans in the whole world. Now when you're freezing berries so they don't all stick together, my recommendation is to put them on a cookie sheet, freeze them until they're hard, and then move them into freezer bags. That works really great. Now, you're all familiar with Ziploc freezer bags. I cannot say enough about them because they are very good. If you don't have a lot of moisture in there, you shouldn't have much in the way of problems with freezer burn. Now, when I freeze my beans, I use a method called blanching. And what that involves is snapping the beans into bite-sized pieces, putting them into a kettle of boiling water, boiling them for the right amount of time, which you'll find on the website for the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And they'll tell you how many minutes to boil them. You strain them out of there, put them into a sink of ice cold water, let them cool down, drain them and dry them, put them in freezer bags, and they'll keep really well for you. But freezing is a very simple way to preserve your harvest. Now, if you can handle one more freezer tip, I want to pass this along to you so that it will save you some grief. I like to make freezer jam, and this is something I don't have to can in the water bath canner. I can put it into either a glass jar or a container like this with a snap-on lid and just freeze it and use it when we want it. Well, the first time I ever did this, I used a regular mouth jar, and what happens is when something freezes, it expands, right? And so what happened is this went up, it hit the curvy part of the jar near the top, and it cracked and broke the jar. Yikes. So my recommendation to you is to use a wide mouth jar because it's got a nice straight edge. As this freezes, it goes up, it doesn't meet any resistance. Or again, use a container like this where you can snap the lid on. It's got a nice straight side. You won't have any problems whatsoever. Let's talk about canning. There's two different types. There's water bath canning and pressure canning. Now, water bath canning is more commonly done. It's pretty straightforward. And you will need what's called a water bath canner. It's pretty easy to find in places that sell canning supplies. And it involves a large kettle. It comes with a rack inside that you use for lifting out your jars. Have a lid. And the idea is that you fill it with water, bring it to a boil, and then according to the recipe that you're following, you will put your canning jars inside. They've got lids screwed on the top, and you will let it come back to a boil. Boil it for the number of minutes that is on the recipe, and then carefully remove them without burning yourself and let them cool. There's two other pieces of equipment you'll want to have. This is a jar lifter, and they're not terribly expensive, and it's for lifting the jars safely in and out of the kettle. And then a jar funnel. This fits inside the jar so that you can ladle in the contents and not make a huge mess. Very inexpensive. You can get them either in metal or plastic. And of course you're going to need canning jars. This is very important that you use canning jars and canning lids. So they come in different sizes. This is a wide mouth quart size. Here's a 1.5 pint size, pint size. I believe this is a half pint, and this is a 6-ounce jelly jar. Now they also have two different size openings. This is a wide mouth, but you can get quart size in a regular mouth as well. And then this is a regular mouth. So the canning lids are two-part. The first thing you have is a flat lid that you put onto the jar once you have filled the jar and cleaned off the rim, because contact is really important to get a good seal. And then you need a ring that you tighten around the jar. Now, when would you use a water bath canning method? You can use it for anything that is very acidic. So fruits and pickles, things that have a vinegar type of a brine in them. And those are safe to process. So I use water bath canning to make relishes. I use it for canning all kinds of fruits, whether it's like an applesauce, a fruit juice, anything at all that is fruit. And that's because it's high in acid. I also use it for jams and jellies. So this is a very simple, straightforward method and a great way to preserve things that are either pickled or fruits, both of which are highly acidic. There's one other thing I wanted to mention about making jams and jellies. You know, in the good old days, what we used to do is we would melt paraffin wax. We'd fill a jar with the jam or jelly that we've made, and then pour the melted paraffin over it to form a seal. We did that for years. We all survived our early days. But what they have learned since then is that it really doesn't form 100% of a seal. And oftentimes what will happen is different kinds of molds can develop within the jam or jelly, even with that paraffin seal on top. So I definitely do not recommend doing that. I would heartily recommend using the water bath canner, even for jams and jellies. Now before I move on, I want to point out something that is the coolest thing ever. This is still a water bath canner, but it is electric. The kettle that I showed you a few moments ago is one that you would put on the top of your range. The thing that I don't like about canning indoors during the heat of the summer is that you heat up the kitchen and yourself. And so we bought this electric canner a few years ago, and it is slick because it's outside, it doesn't heat up the kitchen, it's very easy to use, and it has a good capacity. So I just wanted to point this out. It's something you might look into. Sure, it's more expensive than the other one, but this has lasted for quite a few years. It's working really well for us, and I do recommend it. Now I would show you what a pressure canner looks like, but I don't own one. They kind of give me the heebie-jeebies, even though they are very safe as long as you follow the directions. But they're like a pressure cooker. It's just that they are a little more specific and precise as far as dialing in the amount of pounds of pressure you want. You absolutely must use a pressure cooker if you want to preserve any kind of vegetables, meats, or fish. It is absolutely important. Why is that? Because each of those things are very low in acidity. And if you don't use a pressure canner, what happens is the potential for botulism. And if you haven't heard of that, it is a deadly toxin, or it can paralyze people. I'm not being alarmist here, I'm just being realist. It is so important that you understand this. So do not try to can meats, fish, or any kind of vegetable products as long as they're not pickled in a regular water bath canner. Dehydrating is another way to preserve your harvest. Now this is like the mother of all food dehydrators, and my husband and I bought this probably like 35 years ago. It's the Bee Buyer food dryer, and it has worked really well for us. I don't even know if they're made anymore, but it has all kinds of trays in here that have screening on them and a great thermostat because you want to dry things at quite a low heat. And it's a lower heat than what's available on ovens these days. So there are a lot of different types of food dehydrators around. You can also sun dry things. But if you decide to go with a commercial dehydrator, I would recommend something that's relatively small. They're a lot less expensive than they used to be. And what you can use them for is drying fruits, making fruit leathers, drying herbs, drying vegetables like zucchini chips, things like that. But it is a great method for preserving your harvest. I should also mention that food dehydrators will come with information that tells you how long to dry something. If you can't find information with yours on what you want to dry, go to the website that I gave you because they will have lots of reliable information. Now, one thing I don't want to forget to mention is refrigerator pickles. You can find all sorts of recipes for them. You just store them in your refrigerator and make sure you use them up within the time that's stated on the recipe. So that's an easy way to preserve some of your harvest. Now, the most important thing I want you to remember is to preserve your produce safely. Follow all of the directions to the letter because remember that there are some things that really need extra special handling. I hope this overview was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'll see you next week. Happy gardening and preserving.